Welcome to the Arc of Grace Harbor's Maximizing Financial Resources virtual presentation. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Christy Childs. I'm the Director of Information Services and Parent-to-Parent Coordinator for the Arc of Grace Harbor. Welcome to our workshop, Maximizing Financial Resources. We're so excited to have you all here with us today. So with this workshop, we're aiming to empower families and individuals with the knowledge and tools needed to maximize the financial resources that are available to them, particularly through ABLE and Developmental Disabilities Trust Fund accounts. For those of you who might not be familiar with the Arc of Grace Harbor, we're a nonprofit organization that provides advocacy, education, and support services to individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities, their family, and the community at large. We believe that everyone deserves to live a full and meaningful life, and we're committed to providing the resources and support necessary to make that a reality. Without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce our guest speaker, Lawson Knight. Lawson is a Developmental Disabilities Endowment Trust Fund board member, a financial advisor, and most importantly, a devoted father to his daughter Molly, who has Down syndrome. His wife Cindy is the executive director of the Walla Walla Valley Disability Network, and together they have a wealth of knowledge and experience in the disability community. Lawson is here as a father and volunteer, dedicating his expertise to helping families understand the often complex world of financial planning for a loved one with IDD. We're excited to learn from him and grateful for his willingness to share his expertise with our community. So once again, thank you for joining us today, and we hope you find this workshop informative and valuable.
Thanks so much for that intro. Are you all able to see the PowerPoint now on your screen? Excellent. So our title today is Using ABLE and Developmental Disability Endowment Trust Fund Accounts. And as far as an agenda goes, most of what I'm going to do, I'm going to compare and contrast DDETF and ABLE. Then I want to make sure we talk about considerations for why you might pick one over the other or actually use both. And then we'll take a peek at how you'd actually get started and then leave enough time at the end for questions. It was important, I thought, that Christy mentioned. So I am a licensed financial advisor. Our industry gets pretty persnickety about what we can and can't do. So tonight shouldn't be construed as me giving you advice. We're providing education about these things. Everybody's case is individual. The case I'll be talking most about is my individual case, which is what we've chosen to do with our daughter, Molly. You'll see a lot of these initials and names over and over, DDETF and ABLE, and we'll get into those more specifically, but both are really valuable tools in terms of the financial capabilities that we put to use when doing special needs planning in Washington State. All right, so when we look at comparing these, we're going to look at what they are, why you might choose one or the other, what are the roles people play? How is the money managed? How you get the money in? How you get the money out? And then some considerations about taxes and estates. All of the information that I'm sharing, you can find on the internet when you dive into both our Washington State ABLE site and our Developmental Disability Endowment Trust Fund site. So let's take a first look then at what's the DDETF and what's ABLE. So these are both programs authorized under Washington law. DDETF came first, legislation that was passed around 1999. The E in the initials endowment was part of an appropriation of $9 million with the idea that it would endow the program to seed funding and help contribute alongside Washingtonians so that resources would be put aside for people with disabilities. In practical terms, it is a pooled special needs trust. It excludes assets from federal means-tested benefit programs for large and small contributors alike. The large contribution thing becomes particularly important, and we'll look at that more in a bit. We'll contrast a pooled special needs trust to an ABLE account, which is a tax-advantaged savings account that also excludes the balance inside that account from means tested benefit programs. The two primary benefits programs that we're thinking of are Social Security income and Medicaid, essentially Washington Apple Health. So the health insurance programs and the income programs for people with disabilities. And the basic test is you can't have more than $2,000 in income or assets. And that's not a big number. It's never been indexed for inflation since the legislation was put in place since the 70s. So these two tools in particular make it possible for disability to not be having poverty as a condition of a disability. Right? Okay, so a pooled special needs trust and a tax advantage savings account. So why might you choose one of these? Let's start first on the left here with DDETF. So first, funds are going to be exempt from the federal means tested benefits. So we just talked about that. And that the dollars that are inside a trust account do not count towards that $2,000 limit. There's also this small bullet here on the $3,000 limit on money in a guardianship that might require a bond. So the original endowment was several $1 million, and the earnings from the endowment were used to pay for program matches. So a current board priority, for instance, is it costs $600 to start a DDETF account. There are still matching funds available to match that cost. We'll talk a little bit more about that structure, but the idea that if you put 600 in as a cost to start it and it goes to zero, it's automatically filled back up again with public matching funds. What's another thing that we have to see? We have to see that the beneficiary is not competent to spend the money wisely or appropriately. And the testimonial trust can transfer wealth to younger generations. I'm going to talk about that more specifically when we talk about different trust types. For ABLE, the money parts are pretty similar. It just comes under a federal set of code instead of state code, and there's actually a broader definition of disability. So for DDETF, the disabling condition must be in place before age 26. You must be a DDA client. You must be a Washington state resident. ABLE doesn't have the DDA requirement, and it uses a federal definition of disability. So they overlap in terms of the people that are eligible for DDETF are eligible for ABLE, but we might not see the reverse, where somebody that could be eligible for an ABLE account may not necessarily be eligible for a DDETF account. I think it's also wise to point out here that ABLE was created by federal law, and as a result, all states are required now to have ABLE programs, where not every state has a pooled special needs trust opportunity like DDETF. The other final thing before going to the next slide that I want you to see is this idea of the beneficiary or the authorized legal guardian retains control over the funds. We're going to talk about that more as it relates to roles, but the beneficiary can, basically use the money in the ABLE account, where money in the trust account, there's a third party involved in making decisions about whether or not the use of those funds are appropriate. And that becomes pretty important. All right, so what are roles? You can tell that on one side, the list is longer, and it speaks to the complexity of the trust versus, say, ABLE. So if we start with ABLE, there's basically two roles. There's one that's called the authorized legal representative, and the other is called the beneficiary. So in the case of daughter Molly at the Knight household, I am the authorized legal representative. Molly is the beneficiary. So it basically means I'm the one that can go in and look at the account and move money around and those sorts of things. If we take money out, guess who it's got to be used for? It's got to be used for Molly. Okay. But I don't have to ask anybody else whether or not I can use the money or how I might invest the money. As the authorized legal representative, I get to be in the driver's seat. Okay. DDETF has several additional roles, and it's mostly related to trust law. And trusts are inherently more complicated than other forms of accounts. So first off, a trust must have a donor. Sometimes that's called a settler. Sometimes it's called a grantor. Basically, it's the person who puts the money in. The other thing that a trust has a trustee. In the state of Washington, the trustee is Department of Commerce and its contract agency, the ARC of Washington. The trustee has to work in the best interest of the beneficiary, but they decide whether or not money should be distributed. Okay, that's an important point that I just made right there, so I'm going to make it again. In the case of a trustee, the trustee must act in the best interest of the beneficiary, but they don't have to distribute money if they don't feel it's in the best interest of the beneficiary. Where on the ABLE side, if the authorized legal representative wants to distribute the money, hey, they can. There are two additional roles I want you to be aware of over at DDETF, the legal representative and the primary representative. Those might be the same person. Oftentimes that's a parent, okay? And it would be the person that might say, please make a distribution on behalf of a beneficiary. It's also where the trustees may go to find out whether or not, hey, is this something that we want to see these resources used for? Over time, when we lose a primary representative, let's say mom and dad pass away, there can be a secondary representative that can take over that role. But as part of creating an account, oftentimes there's a commentary left so that the trustee can act always in the interest of the beneficiary based on the instructions of the original donor or primary representative. Okay, so that can be a benefit of having the trust, right? Is that the thought process and values behind why the money was put there can be carried down through the trust, through the direction of the primary and secondary representatives, and even through the commentary left for the trustees. All right, on to the next thing. Let's talk about how it's managed. So both of these programs authorized under Washington law have a governor-appointed board. And we oversee as board members that the program is operated according to the policies, procedures, and law of the state of Washington. On a practical level, on a day-to-day basis, the programs are administered through the Department of Commerce. In general, the Department of Commerce then contracts the activity onto some other agency. In the case of investments at DDETF, all investments are done by the Washington State Investment Board. So our money is right alongside our public employee retirement system. And we use an investment policy that we review annually and monitor as governing board members. On the ABLE side, that program is contracted to Bank of New York Mellon. They've subsequent to the start of the contract came up with a fancy new brand name for investment services, the subsidiary that actually manages the money. And then the platform that we access ABLE is called Someday, S-U-M, not S-O-M-E, Someday. And that's the web-based interface that we use to interact with the beneficiary account. A little bit more detail here, and we'll get into this on subsequent slides, but you can see on the last bullet here under ABLE that you can elect which investment option. There is exactly one investment option at DDETF. It's the one that we choose and think is best. At ABLE, we have multiple investment options, from keeping everything in cash to trying to put everything in the stock market. Okay, so investment risk is on the ABLE account, where inside the Developmental Disability Endowment Trust Fund, investment risk is at the trust pool level and determined by the board. All right, so let's talk how we put money in. So first you have to open an account, and I'm going to talk about two different types of accounts at DDETF. The first we'll talk about is called the third-party trust. A third-party trust is when somebody who is not the beneficiary opens an account. Let's talk again about daughter Molly. Lawson and Cindy Knight opened a third-party trust account. That distinction is really important because if there's money that's left over at the end of Molly's life, that remainder passes on to the heirs that we choose, whether that be other family members or charities. Okay. On the ABLE account, all of the money in the account first goes to the estate, and we'll get into this again later, but I'm going to introduce it here. And Medicaid can crawl back the value of the account. So if money was set aside from state resources to help our kiddos out, and sorry to reference that oftentimes these are parent-child relationships. Interestingly, DDETF often opens a lot of accounts through disability service providers and housing providers who act as the legal representative. But in some of these, as is the case in the other form at DDETF, the money that is set aside once we lose that beneficiary, certain public agencies have the right to go ask for those assets because they spent a fair bit of resources in providing healthcare and income benefits. Here's the other really important part on this DDETF thing. No limits on balances, okay? And you might think, well, I mean, how much money does someone need? Well, what if you set up one of these third-party ones as a young parent and you got in a car accident and you had a life insurance policy and the life insurance policy was $150,000. Well, if you assigned that benefit for your child to an ABLE account, they will begin to shrink your SSI balance. Where if we put that in a DDF account, the balance, the benefits wouldn't shrink. So that balance provision ends up being important depending on the planning need. You can also see that there is no lifetime maximum for the amount of money that could be put in an endowment trust fund account where there's a lifetime balance limit of $500,000 at ABLE. You can also see that there's a limit on the amount that can be contributed, $15,000 per year. There's an asterisk here, and that's called able to work. So if we have a beneficiary that actually earned money through a job, they can put money in their ABLE account so that they're under the $2,000 limit for income-based testing, but it doesn't count towards the $15,000 per year. So in general, how are contributions made? To be honest, the most convenient way that I've seen is you just write a check and drop it in the mail. The other thing that I've seen work fairly well for folks is they go onto their online bank or credit union and they establish a monthly automatic bill pay, and a check is just dropped in the mail. The organizations themselves are very good at processing these, but we don't have super great electronic transfers. So just beware of that part. There's also this clever e-gifting thing. So just like you could have a GoFundMe page, there are some things that you could establish for a beneficiary, as anyone is eligible to contribute to an ABLE account on behalf of a beneficiary, you know, up to those lifetime and annual maximums. So that's how money gets in. How is money taken out? Let's start with ABLE. Again, it's the more simple of the two, although I don't want to say that getting money out of a DDETF trust account is that complicated. Basically, though, at ABLE, if you connect it to a bank account, you just transfer it. Ta-da. You can also request a check to be mailed. And probably the most clever thing is you can pay for a debit card. Often it will have two names on it. It will have the beneficiary and the authorized legal representative, and you'll end up with a swipe card. There's a maximum, usually that's a cap. It's I thought it was around $500 that you can upload to the card, and that's for, you know, essentially fraud prevention. You know, my use case here is daughter Molly. Molly most likes to spend her money on other people. She really doesn't like to buy stuff, but she likes to buy stuff for other people. That can create vulnerability when a debit card is put into the wrong hands. So ABLE has put some caps on there. So you literally upload money from the ABLE account onto the debit card, kind of as a prepaid thing, but it allows for electronic swiping, which is increasingly just the method of payment. For instance, our local grocery outlet no longer accepts paper checks. You know, so this allows somebody with a disability to have an electronic means of payment without having to have their own bank account. At DDETF, again, the trustee is making the distribution. So you submit a disbursement request form to the trust. If the expense has not occurred yet, they'll often write the check to the vendor. Okay, so like let's say, and this happens, it's kind of fun to see these sorts of things because these accounts allow for people to have normal lives or fun lives. We have a DDETF trust holder that likes to go to Seahawk games. So they submit for, please send money to the Seattle Seahawks to buy football tickets. That's a permissible expense under the Developmental Disability Endowment Trust Fund. check is made out to the Seattle Seahawks and off it goes. But there's no electronic transfer. Okay, there's not like you can go in and vend this, with a debit card. In terms of timeliness, it's going to take business days for money to leave the trust and make it to a vendor. So from a timeliness point of view, there's also a speed aspect to ABLE that's better. You've got immediate access to transfer money, usually overnight to a bank, or if you've already loaded money onto a debit card, again, that money's immediately available. So those are considerations, I think, that you should think about when thinking about both of these two. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about taxes in the states. Over at the DDETF, earnings from investments are potentially taxed. That really only happens if we distribute money. Okay, so the contributions are invested in a portfolio of stocks and bonds. They're earning dividends and interest income over time. Sometimes when we sell things, we generate a thing called capital gains. When people take money out, the portion of the check, let's call it $1,000, some will be interest income, some will be dividend income, some will be contributions. You get a form, it's called a K-1 at the end of each year, that would say, of the money that was distributed, this was taxable. And it's part of having to prepare a tax return for the beneficiary. Okay. I talked about this earlier, but let's look at the trust one called third party. And this language is interchangeable at DDETF, and this is an important nomenclature thing. So we've got over at the Developmental Disability Endowment Trust Fund, we've got two flavors of trusts. And sometimes you'll just see it, oh, you've got a trust one. And you're like, well, what's that? I don't know what that means. Well, that's a third party. Okay. And the third party, again, just means that it is funded by someone who is not the beneficiary, that is not the person with a disability. Any remainder amount transfers according to a beneficiary designation in the trust. So the money that you contributed doesn't go to the state. Now, I want to say that just a little bit more, the money you contributed. If you got a match, okay, so if there's matching funds in the trust, those can be reclaimed by the state if they're unused and matched for somebody else. So that, back to the idea of an endowment, that these resources can go to help people with disabilities in our state into the future. Number two, trust two is called self-settled. A self-settled trust means that the donor, the grantor, the settler, the person who stuffs the money in, is also the beneficiary. Okay, so back to daughter Molly. If Molly has money from work and she's pushing above $2,000 in any account, we might set up a trust two for her so she can put her money there and not have to worry about the means-based test. That's why somebody would get a trust two. And I'll talk about maybe fitting these things together here as we get near the end. All right, ABLE accounts, what happens is they pay out to an estate in a probate, which is the process of running somebody's estate. Creditors can make claims on assets. So ABLE money is eligible to be claimed for things like Medicare and SSI. Okay. And once those funds are recovered, if there's any money left over, then a residual can pass on to other beneficiaries of an estate. Most often, though, we see, ABLE balance are consumed by that Medicaid crawlback. Okay. So how might you get started? This is just a screenshot of the homepage for the Developmental Disability Endowment Trust Fund. And when you land here, you might go, well, what do I do now? Okay. One, there's a ton of just information here, and you could start right in the upper middle with the frequently asked questions. But the link right to the left, forms, is where you would actually download what's called the joinder agreement. Joinder agreement. So you actually apply to join the Special Needs Trust. So you fill out a bunch of forms, you sign them, they must be notarized, you send in your $600, ta-da! You now have one of two trusts, either a trust one or a trust two, a third party or a self-settled. So you'd come to the DDETF .wa.gov website, and you'd click on Forms to get the documents you would need to open a trust account. And that is to complete the joinder agreement. And this is all language taken from hundreds of years of trust law. So when I make up these words that you've never heard before, you'll never hear them again unless you're in this trust world. They're just not frequently used. Okay, the other place you might go is to WashingtonStateABLE.com. And you can tell in the upper right, there's a button. It says open an account. And that's where you begin to make application to open a Washington State ABLE account. There's some things that will test for eligibility, and you need to be the legal representative, and you need to know some information about the beneficiary. They've got some whiz-bang high-tech stuff that goes into, setting goals and how you might pick your investment elections and those kinds of things, and where money might come from to deposit into the account. It's a relatively painless process to open an account online. And I think the annual fee is still waived in the first year, and it's like $35 a year to have one. So from a cost point of view, the cost differences, the ABLE account would be cheaper to begin with. Okay, so I think my next slide says questions, but what I want to do before I open to questions, Christy, is talk a little bit about how we might use these two things together. Okay, so one of the most important things that I would want you to know about both together, the DDETF can make trust distributions to an ABLE account. I'm going to say that one again, because what's that mean? A trust account can make a distribution to a DDETF account. Well, if there's a maximum contribution of $14,000 that can be made to an ABLE account, and I had a trust one, so like a parent, a third-party trust, we might park our money over there because, again, any leftover goes to our heirs, and make an annual contribution to the ABLE account so that we have an easy way to spend. I almost think about it like ABLE is the checking account and DDETF is the investment account. Okay. And the reason is that at least on the third party, the trust one, where there's a risk that, let's say through our estate, there might be a balance higher than $100,000, we're not risking a decrease in benefits for the beneficiary like we would over in an ABLE account. Okay. If, however, you're going, there's no way ever we're going to have anything approaching that kind of money at our house, then go the simple route and start with an ABLE account. It is really convenient for small dollar amounts. It's also for the sort of person that wants to do the DIY investing. There are more investment options at ABLE than there is at DDETF. I do want to give one investment math thing though, and think about long periods of time. I was just doing this with a parent that was looking at their high school kid. Okay, so let's take somebody age 16 and they have $10,000 in an ABLE account. And mom and dad really don't see that this young person is going to spend from it during their lifetime. Okay, well, they also think that they might try to have him put a job together and they might contribute some money. Okay, well, if I can double money in an investment account every 10 years, then by the time he's probably 35 or 40, we're through the $100,000 balance and we're beginning to see a decrease in federal benefits. So when we see that there's a probability that the balance could exceed $100,000, that's the note to self, like alert, alert. I better go get one of those DDETF trust accounts if I don't have one of those right now. Okay.
Thank you for joining us for today's presentation. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to the ARC at 360-537-7000 or email info@arcgh.org.